Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel today, Still I Rise from Adversity. I am so excited to be moderating the panel. My name is Pooja Mehta, and some of you might remember me. I used to work at NAMI, North Carolina. But for those of you that don't, I am a mental health advocate and speaker, and I'm very excited to be joined by Jose, Doylin, and Iman today to speak about their experiences with mental health and adversity. Jose, would you like to give a short little introduction about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Jose Rosario. I'm a speaker and a PhD student in psychology right now. My work, both personally and professionally, focuses on cultural trauma among minoritized populations, given discrimination and privilege and oppression. And so this is really, this is my jam. This is what I do. And so I'm excited to be here today with all of you.
Thank you so much. And Doylin, would you like to introduce yourself? I love the mask on the statue behind you, by the way.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure that it's 6 feet behind me, but I don't know if that's legit or not, but at least, it's following protocol. But as far as me, I'm Doylin Richards. I am a best-selling author. My books are on the wall behind me. I am an anti-racism facilitator and champion of mental health. And I actually just delivered my very first TED Talk a couple of weeks ago. So I'm super excited to share that with you when that becomes available. And I am so honored and thrilled to be here.
Wow, that's incredible. I can't wait to see your TED Talk.
Thank you.
Iman, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Iman Siddiqi, and I'm a freshman at East Carolina University, where I'm currently an EC scholar. And I interned with NAMI when I was a senior in high school, and I worked with the Ending the Silence program. And I'm really honored that you guys are with me today and that I get to speak on this panel.
Wonderful. So as you can see, we have three incredible panelists here with us today. And I personally am so excited to get to learn from them, and I hope all of you are as well. So let's just go ahead and dive into it. We're going to be talking a lot about the intersection of mental health, race, equity, diversity, and how all of these things come together and play with each other and really influence the way that we talk and think about mental health and mental illness. So just to go off the bat, three words that are thrown around these days are diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do these terms really mean? What do they mean to you, and how do they relate to each other?
I'll start. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it starts with like the people. Diversity are the people that are there. Inclusion is like, hey, my voice is a part of this decision. And equity is basically everyone having the same opportunity to voice their opinions or be heard or what have you. But I'm a big fan of making complicated things simple. And if we really want to talk about this, it's just don't be a jerk. If everyone just followed that rule in life, don't be a jerk. I would usually use much more colorful language, but I'm being professional. Instead of jerk, I would say something else. But don't be a jerk. If you're not a jerk, then you'll know that diversity, inclusion, and equity are baseline things that you just need to be a good human being. This is not complicated. We raise our kids to not be jerks. So somehow it gets lost in the shuffle and translation as we get older. But if we just go back to that simple premise, the world will be a much better place.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I think that was beautiful. Don't be a jerk is such a great way to look at it, right? But it's also this idea of like throwing these words around diversity, equity, and inclusion don't actually make you inclusive. Like there's work that goes behind that. You have to be willing to like, if you're going to tell people your voice belongs and we're going to make space for your voice, then you actually have to make space. And that requires making a lot of changes in a system that might not even be prepared for you to make those changes. And so I would encourage everyone, when you think about these three words, I think they're buzzwords, but there's a lot more that goes to this work than just saying these three words and calling it a day.
I mean, there's nothing really that I can add that you guys haven't already said. I mean, like really what Jose was saying, you really need to just put the work into it. You need to adopt the mentality for yourself. And then once you have that, then you need to be able to work and get other people around you to adopt that mentality.
I think that's such a good point, you know, Jose, especially to what you said. Saying it is not enough. We have to act on it. We have to really embody it and put it into the systems that we are trying to change. So, to that end, how do you feel like diversity, equity, and inclusion are or are not being played out in the mental health care system? And what do you think we need to do to change that?
I have a couple of thoughts on that, if that's okay, Jose and Iman, to start. So my quick story is that I know in the intro I was saying like, oh, I'm a best-selling author, all this nonsense, but I actually almost took my own life 3 years ago due to depression. And I am very open about that because there aren't too many, first off, there are not too many dudes who are going to admit to that. And secondly, there ain't too many dudes of color who are going to be talking about that. So the fact is that I want to normalize the stuff that's going on right now. And as far as, and also, guys, I don't know if you all know, but our country is on fire right now. It's a dumpster fire going on out there. And people of color are struggling the most. And if we're not able to have these conversations about what mental health looks like and making it sure that it's equitable and accessible for everyone, because a lot of people of color don't feel comfortable going to the HR department about help. A lot of schools are racist as all get out when it comes to kids and kids of color. I mean, kids of color are 3 times more likely to be suspended from school than white kids for similar infractions, behavioral infractions. So these kids are struggling, parents are struggling, the world's on fire right now. So it is hard, and we really need to have a lot of empathy for what's going on with people of color right now in order to make this world a better place.
Thanks so much for starting us off. I think that was a great place to start off because we need to acknowledge it. I also want to throw out there that I'm coming at this as a mental health professional who is Latino, LGBT, and uses a wheelchair. So you can think about all those complexities of identity as I tell you sort of my experience in the mental health system. But looking at both sides, looking at both being represented and feeling like there are people out there who understand experiences within my communities, and then being the person who's expected to provide services to people, I think we are scratching the surface at even acknowledging diversity. I think that there's a lot of fear associated with having to acknowledge that people are different from us and then having to find a way to be inclusive. I don't even think we've started that work yet. I think a lot of our therapies, a lot of the ways that we approach mental health and talk about mental health are still full of stigma. We don't understand ways in which we need to change mental health work. I am a huge proponent of this idea that mental health work is not a one size fits all. Every person's experience is a part of all of their identities coming together. And so I don't even think, and you know, again, I'm in the field, so I can't bash the field too much, but I think that we're not even close to where we could be and where we should be. I think equity and inclusion oftentimes are just not even thought of. We're still on the diversity piece of like, oh, people are different. How do we acknowledge that? And we have to push the needle further. And so that's why I'm glad we're here talking about these kinds of things.
I think it's really important that there are people like Jose who work in the mental health field because as somebody who's had like multiple like mental health care professionals I've encountered, there are not a lot of, you know, people of color or people who are diverse that can really understand like the certain issues that come with being a person of color or like a person of a different religion. So that's definitely something that, you know, it helps. Like people don't think about it that much, but it helps so much to have somebody that looks like you or that can relate to you and really understand your problems, especially now when things are like, I mean, I'm going to quote a dumpster fire. Like everything is going insane. Nobody knows what's happening. And so it's really important to have somebody to talk to, especially now.
Iman, I think you bring up a really great point about diversity in providers. I am a patient of the mental health care system, and it has been so hard trying to find a therapist that I can relate to and who can relate to me, where I don't have to explain my cultural history and my upbringing and my background and, you know, all of the things that make me unique as a child of immigrants. And you know, we need more diversity in the playing field. We need more diversity in the providers that are available to us who can really relate to us on a personal level, because mental health is so important when it comes to the background that you come from.
Hey, Pooja,
So,
before you move on to the next question, I just want to piggyback on what you just said, because that's a
yeah,
really good point. Because I think often we look at kids that are growing up, and I always ask when I'm training people, like, I ask them, how old were you or what grade were you in when you had your first Black teacher? Not PE teacher, not like a basketball coach, like your first like academic Black teacher. And most people are like, oh man, that didn't even happen until high school, didn't even happen until college or in post grad. And I bring that up because kids who look like me are conditioned to think like, hey, there's no one out here who looks like me who's going to help me with this stuff. My teachers are white, my doctors are white, you know, all these people are white. So then when we don't feel comfortable talking about this stuff with people who don't have our lived experiences, and that's one of the reasons why we don't go to doctors often, or we don't go to mental health professionals as often as we would like to.
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, you are more trusting of people who come from the same cultural background of you as you. And if you don't see people who look like you, who don't understand you, then you're not going to engage with the system. So let's back up a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about why we don't see a lot of diversity in the healthcare systems that we operate within. Um, I think there is, like you said, you know, the doctors are white, the mental health care professionals are white, the EMTs are white, everybody is white. And what do you think it is about our culture, our upbringing, our diverse backgrounds that are, or even the system that are preventing people of color from being represented in these fields?
I have an answer, guys, if you want me to just say it real quick. I mean, I think this is probably the easiest question in the world to answer. White supremacy. I mean, let's just be real. And this is the thing, y'all. This is the thing. Let me just, don't get it twisted. When you think of white supremacy, we're not talking about KKK. We're not talking about bombing me on the street. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the fact that from 1776 to now, 2020, we have from 1776 to 1965, when the Civil Rights Act was put out there, white supremacy was the law of the land. It was the law. Like, Black people can't eat here. Black people can't go to school here. Black people can't do all these things. That was the law of the land. So in the 55 years that we've had since then, we're trying to get back to some sort of normalcy, or not normalcy, but some sort of equity with Black people, but we're not there yet. So we're not even close to being there. So a lot of that makes it really difficult. And people don't look at me as someone who could be a doctor, a lawyer, an author. You know, it's always like, hey, he must be a basketball player. I played ball in college, but still, that's besides the point. I was, you know, basketball player, rapper, whatever, not someone who actually uses his mind to make the world a better place. And that, a lot of times, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, excuse me, for kids who see this, and it gets a little difficult.
Not to mention the like identity gymnastics that you have to endure in order to like work around almost these stereotypes, and the code switching that needs to happen in order for you to even be able to think about these things even being a possibility. I mean, speaking candidly, to get into graduate school, in psychology, a lot of programs still require the GRE, which is literally a measure of social class. It's a measure of how much do you know about what we think is important. And our cultures, our backgrounds are not considered in these types of like assessments and milestones that we're expected to meet. And I mean, you said it perfectly. There are so many different expectations or different limits and standards set for BIPOC people. And we have to work twice as hard to then navigate these things if we ever want to make a difference. But the more troubling piece to me is that there aren't people out there who can give us the mentorship and guidance to say, you can do this, and here you are. I mean, in my program, there's one person of color in faculty, and he's my advisor, and just so happened that we matched. But I mean, what about all of the other BIPOC students out there who don't have this space? We still have a long way to go.
So I'm probably going to be speaking about this like from a younger person's perspective, like somebody who's like just starting out college and trying to figure out like what I want to do and where I want to go. So I know that a lot of the people around me, like their parents, like the generation before us, especially when we think about immigrant families, like they didn't have a choice but to choose the path that they would think would be the most successful. And in many cases, that's like, I mean, doctor or medical field or something like that. And so, but when it comes to mental health, they never really thought about psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist being a good option. And that's why you don't see a lot of, you know, South Asian, like Desi, Indo-Pak therapists or psychologists, because they never thought that that was really the best option for them. And so now, like as a young person, it's becoming like I'd say a little bit more normalized, but we don't have people to look up to because there aren't people to look up to.
Iman, I absolutely agree with that. You know, being part of the Desi community, I have heard a lot, and I think it subscribes to the model minority myth that we need to be a certain type of successful in order to conform to what society thinks of us. And unfortunately, being a psychiatrist, being a therapist, being a social worker, being a counselor doesn't fall into that narrative. And, you know, you bring up a really interesting point about how white supremacy is the kind of facilitator of all of this lack of diversity in the field. But I'm wondering, what would you and anyone else on the panel, what would you say about, you know, internal stigmas relating to mental health and mental illness, like internal cultural stigmas? How does that play into the way that we interact with the system? And, you know, if you have an answer, where does that originate from, and how does that resolve itself?
Yeah, no doubt. I have a lot of thoughts on that, because in the Black community, and it's like we're not a monolith. I mean, everyone's different, but from what my experience was, like Black dudes don't talk about this stuff. We don't talk about, oh man, I'm feeling depressed right now. Like things are just not good. I don't feel like it's not something that we truly talk about. And then not only that, like when you're around your boys and you're just chilling, it's not like there's no real safe space to talk about it. That's why 78% of suicide victims are men, because we get to the point where it becomes so overwhelming because we can't talk to anyone that we end up eating a gun, we end up swinging from a ceiling, because we just we can't talk to people about this. We don't feel comfortable with it. And part of my job and my role is to be like, look, y'all, I've done stuff in life. I'm doing a good job. But the thing is, it's like I still deal with depression. And it's okay. It is okay to feel this way. It's okay to not feel okay, is really what I'm trying to tell people. And I think it's just the stigma of growing up with it. We don't feel comfortable talking about it. This is not a conversation that happens in many Black households or many BIPOC households, sadly, especially with men. So we're trying to shed that stigma as best we can.
I also think that, you know, if you think about families who have migrated or immigrated here, there are so many stressors and so many layers that are being confronted at the same time that oftentimes there isn't the opportunity to focus on mental health, and sometimes that's seen as a privilege, just having the time to even think about how someone's feeling. And there's also, I think, some fear associated. I think you really put it well. I was smiling as you were talking because when I told my Latina grandmother I wanted to be a psychologist, she was like, well, why would you do that? Like, go do something else. And the concept was so foreign to her because she was like, what do you mean you're going to work in mental health? And it took some time for her to realize, oh, this is like, you're going to be a doctor. And I'm like, no, it's not a doctor. It's somebody who works with people. And so there's still that cultural piece that I think is missing. But maybe because it just hasn't been prevalent, or we haven't had the opportunity to focus on it. And nobody's been telling us that we should be focusing on it, because when you see mental health stories reflected, oftentimes they are stories from a point of privilege.
So what you guys were saying, like, it really struck within me, because I have 2 younger brothers and I want them to be raised in an environment where they don't feel like they can't talk about their feelings at all. Like, that is the last thing I want for them. And also, I feel like a factor that really plays into this is religion as well. Like, I can say some people, like, they're discouraged from really sharing their mental illness because some people make them feel like, oh, because you're feeling this way, you don't have enough faith, or you're unfaithful, or you're not true to religion, or like God doesn't love you. And I think that really, really discourages them and just makes them feel worse. But in reality, that's not true at all. Like, it's like, if you have a fever, do you think that God doesn't love you because of that? It doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. And Iman, I want to take that question and go a little bit further with it. So what do you think, talking about cultural stigmas and talking about how our cultures and our societies really influence the way we talk and think about mental health, how do you think religion has played into that specifically for you?
So for a while, it was something that I really, I struggled with, because, as I went to Islamic school, so I've been raised in a very religious environment pretty much my entire life. And then when I started, I have really bad anxiety, and that really started manifesting when I got into high school. And I just thought that, something was wrong. Like, why is this happening? Like, maybe I'm not praying enough, or maybe I'm not focused in my religion as I should be. And that's why I didn't talk to anyone, because that is like a source of shame almost. And like, it's shameful. And so you can't share that with anybody. And it really just takes people to tell you that, no, it's not. Like, you're not any less of a Muslim, or you're not any less of a Christian, or whatever walk of faith you're from, just because, you feel depression, or you feel anxiety, or you feel anything else. Like, that doesn't make you any less of who you are. It's just another thing that you have to work hard on and struggle through.
Yeah, I remember, when I started having panic attacks and hearing my voices, I would go to the temple and write letters to God and ask God, like, why are you doing this to me? Because I have also grown up in a pretty religious household, and I was always told that, like, God is looking out for you and God is there to protect you. But if that's true, then why do I hear voices in my head trying to tell me to kill myself? And I think, there's some comments that the relationship between religion and mental health and mental illness is very complicated, and sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. Jose, do either of you have thoughts on this that you would like to share with us?
I mean, as a member of the LGBT community, like, my spirituality personally has been a challenging dynamic, and for a long time was probably detrimental to my mental health because of that tension. I find now that holding all of these pieces of me together and acknowledging that they can all exist has been better for my own mental health. I think I'm much more capable of like holding my self-care because I recognize the value of the person in front of me and in the mirror. But I do think there's so many challenges. I mean, again, part of why my grandmother was so resistant was this idea of like, well, if you do that, like you're just avoiding the fact that like they're not praying enough and maybe you should be a pastor. And like these were the kinds of conversations that were happening in my community as well. And I think that when you find a way to accept all of these pieces of you, and I see in the comments somebody said, you know, why are you doing this to me? Having a wheelchair, I often ask God, you know, why did you do this to me? And I recognize now that like representation in mental health matters and that this is a gift rather than something that I should be ashamed of. Because we need to be represented. We need to be very overt about, I am here because I want to be here and because my community deserves to be represented in this way. And that's a gift.
Wonderful. And Jose, you have talked a little bit about, you've like touched on your experience with being LGBT and having that representation within the mental health field. LGBTQ individuals are more than twice as likely as heterosexual people to have a mental health disorder in their lifetime. And they're significantly at more risk for attempting suicide. What do you think are special considerations that we should be taking to address this?
I mean, part of it is we have to acknowledge the structural and systemic stressors that are happening. Like, you're being told that you can't love, that you can't get married, that you can be told you cannot receive health care or employment. Like, these are very real concerns that impact mental health. We have a minority stress theory for LGBTQ plus people who talk about these sort of proximal, more individual stressors and the distal society stressors. But even that doesn't account for what if you're a person of color and LGBT and those compounding stressors. And so I think it's really important when working with all forms of diversity and all different spectrums of identity to acknowledge the fact that we're living in a dumpster fire. I think we're going to go back to that idea of like, this is the society that we're living in. And as a professional, you have to be able to say, wow, there's a lot going on here, and how do we unpack that? And not so much coming in to save people, but at least acknowledging stuff isn't fair. I almost said a bad word, but I'm also going to behave myself today. But stuff isn't fair.
You know, I just wanted to piggyback on what Jose said. I think it's so important to, well, a couple of things. One is, this is just my personal opinion. I don't believe that there's such thing as an ally out there. I don't think allies are a thing. I think we're all allies in training. I don't get to decide if I'm an ally or not, neither do any of you. It's just, we are all trying to be allies in training. So with that being said, I truly believe I stand really strongly with the LGBTQ community because quite frankly, they're so persecuted. Like Jose was saying, all the things like not being able to get married. We're talking about two people who are in love, y'all. Like seriously, like people who are in love. That's what we're fighting against? That's crazy. But people look at me like, oh, well, hey man, you're a straight dude. Why are you on the side of the LGBTQ community? It's like, what? Like I am a black man and I love animals, but I'm not a damn alpaca. I'm not a mountain lion. So I mean, like I still support animals. Like I don't have to be an alpaca or a mountain lion or to like support animals. Like that's so stupid. So that's my whole point. It's like I truly believe that we need more allies in training to step up for marginalized groups right now. And quite frankly, to the white folks who are out there, a lot of those people that we need to step up are you. Look in the mirror, it's you. We need more of you. Being silently like, oh, you know, I'm on that side, but you don't do anything, that ain't doing nothing. Y'all gotta be actively out there fighting for us. We need you because you are in a position of power in this country. So step your game up, stop making excuses. I don't care if you're like, oh my gosh, I'm really shy, I'm really introverted. I don't care. It's not about you. This is about the mission. So step up, get uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, and get into the fight. There's my TED Talk.
I think there's also, just to jump in really quickly, there's also this piece of like, we're living in a world where social media is so prevalent that I think people have this idea that posting a photo on social media is your way of showing this sort of resistance. And I'm not saying resistance takes many forms, but I definitely think somebody said on the chat, active listening is key. Like listening and being willing to say, now that I've heard you, what am I going to do about this? If you're telling me that you have been treated unfairly by this system, and if I have the power or I have a way in which I can support you in making that better, then I need to do something about that. So the active listening needs to be taken into action somehow, for sure.
Yeah, so that was a strong ending, so I'm just going to leave it at that.
So we're talking a lot about active listening and being an active participant in receiving education and acting on education and being an ally. In the interest of educating, we got an audience question, and if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A, and I will be going through them and asking questions to our panelists from there. So a question that we got is, microaggressions are so high for people of color daily. Can you provide some examples and talk a little bit about how you deal with that and how we as a community can try and reduce those that are affecting you on a daily basis?
Ooh, I love this one. Can I start? Because quite frankly, we could just do the like fastest finger thing as a speaker. What do you think? I actually would have you guys in the chat. What do you think is the most common microaggression someone like me gets as a speaker? I just gave you a hint. I want to see who types it in there first because it's so obvious. I get it all the time.
I think I know what you're
Oh,
going for, and
oh,
I am right there with you.
yes, Amy got it first. Ding, ding, ding. You are so well-spoken and articulate. And I think this is really important for you guys to understand. It's like, man, this is like, that's a compliment. You should be complimented. They're being nice to you. Listen to me. This is very, very important. When you say that we are articulate and well-spoken, basically what you're saying is that I'm so shocked. The bar for you is so low that the fact that you can actually string together a couple of sentences together and actually be somewhat articulate is like baffling to me. And I have to put it out there and let everyone know, because white people don't get that compliment very often. People like me get it all the time. So here's a tip, white folks. If you want to compliment someone like me on being articulate, don't call me articulate. Say what I said was articulate, the points that I said. Hey, you articulated that point really well about blah, 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 blah. That's better than calling me articulate, because it's basically saying like, hey, the bar is so low, I'm surprised you didn't trip over it. Like, that's crazy. But just talk about the things that we actually said, not us as human beings.
I mean, echo like times 3. I've had people introduce me saying things like, oh, we're so glad you got up and got dressed this morning, or, you know, he was so weak but he thrived and now look at him. And that's not my story. That's not who I am. If you're going to make comments about my strength and resiliency, how about we talk about the fact that like I'm calling you out and I'm making sure that it is my life's mission to empower those who have been silenced, to say you have a space here and now to talk about your mental health stories, because if we don't talk about them, we can't be better. And so that's the work I'm doing. You're seeing a guy in a wheelchair who you think is like so awesome for like getting up on stage, but really that's only one piece of what I did. The real thing I'm doing here is saying, let's be better together. And I want to be known as a human, not as some sort of object of admiration.
I think what you said was really important. Like, we want to be known as like who we are, not just, you know, some specific part of our characteristic that they think makes us like so important. Like, it's not important. It's just a part of us, basically.
And Pooja, one quick point that I wanted to make before you move on to the next topic is, I was trying to see if I could do this in real time. My daughter, I have a 7-year-old daughter. Here she is. I'm putting her on the screen. You guys can see her. So the reason why I'm showing you her picture is because last year we went to an aquarium, and it's crowded, and I was like looking around, and there was this white dude, stranger, groping my daughter's hair, and sitting here, and I was about to swing on him, and he was like, well, what's the problem? Your daughter has such beautiful hair. And I tried to educate, like, dog, like, if I went up to like blonde hair, blue-eyed Caitlin and started like rubbing her hair, I would be in prison before you could say Black Lives Matter. So why do you think it's okay that you could do that to my child? She's not a freaking zoo animal. She's a child. And I think a lot of times people see things that are unique and different from what they see in the daily basis and feel like it's their right to go observe it and touch it and all that stuff. It's not cool. It's never cool to do that, especially to a child. So, I mean, that was one example that I had to bring up, but wow, that really bothered me.
That is wild. Like, I don't even know what to say. You know, I can definitely relate to this conversation. I have had people come up to me and say, oh, you're so well spoken. Oh, how do you have the strength to do this? Someone once said that my English was really great, and I'm like, cool, because I was born here. Like, thanks. I want to pivot the conversation a little bit, and going back to the healthcare system, can we talk a little bit? We talked a little bit about the need for culturally competent healthcare professionals, and I want to talk a little bit about, you know, how can we encourage people within our communities to start engaging with the system, both from a patient side and from a provider side?
Mental health work, I think, has a history of using mental health care as a way to weaponize against communities who are historically minoritized. And so there's a lot of mistrust around even engaging with the healthcare system in that way. And so I think one of the preliminary steps would be acknowledging the fact that, like, we may have done you wrong in the past. And I say we collectively as like a huge system. We have done some things in the past that have been really wrong. And then saying, how can we center your voices and your experiences to actually provide you meaningful services? Because how many of us have been in a therapy room, for example, and thought, oh, this isn't working. Like you said earlier, Pooja, like, it wasn't understood. Our cultural background isn't understood. And so there needs to be more centering in order for us to even want to engage in these services. Otherwise, we're feeling like we're just trying again and hitting some sort of barrier yet again.
And to piggyback on Jose's point, it's, in my line of work as an anti-racism facilitator, I see this stuff all the time in corporate where people are like, hey, we stand for Black lives and we do all this stuff, and but what are y'all really doing though? Like, for real, like, what are you doing? Because I see that, I look at your boardroom, it's filled with a bunch of white dudes. I see your policies, your HR policies, and you're penalizing Black people, Black women for wearing ethnic hair and braids. You're doing all this stuff, but you're looking at your policies, everything, it's centered around whiteness. Because right now, when you look at this world, whiteness is viewed as normal, correct, and valuable. That's what it is. And everything else is the opposite. So we look at that and we embrace it. Then it's like, okay, we know it's the case. So why don't we find a way to get people of color to feel like they are normal, correct, and valuable? and get them into the game. Look at your policies, educate yourself. I mean, God, I don't know about y'all, like I can't count how many people I've come across who didn't even know that Juneteenth was a thing until this year. But y'all know about Columbus Day? A rapist, a murderer, just a complete, oh, I almost said a bad word, a complete jerk. Like, we know more about that dude than we do about Juneteenth. Like, what are we doing here? I mean, what are we doing here? We need to educate ourselves. We need to be smarter. We need to make sure that we have more people of color at the table when we're making decisions about our lives and how these things impact us.
Oh, going off of what was just said, I feel like there's a lot of, saying, especially now in social media, there's a lot of people like talking about the issues and just, being like, yeah, I stand with, such and such. And I mean, we're all guilty of this. Like, there's a bunch of times we don't take enough action, but there are times like these where we need to do things instead of just saying things.
So to that end, NAMI North Carolina's board recently formed NAMI North Carolina's board recently formed a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. If you could place an item to be on this agenda for the group, what would it be?
Want to start, Jose? Go ahead.
Sure. I guess on a very like preliminary step, go out into the community and actually listen to the stories of your constituency and see what are the mental health concerns of the people in your community actually. And on top of that, maybe consider centering a person of color as the person that goes out into that community, because it's a lot easier to talk to people who seemingly will understand, at least on some level, your experience, and maybe ease those feelings of mistrust. But we need to, instead of trying to bring these things into a boardroom, for example, we actually need to go out into the community, because that's where we're actually going to get the experience of what's going on.
And Jose, to back that up, I agree with you 100%. I would add to that is, y'all, might come off as abrasive, but I'm kind of like a real talk guy, so that's how I roll. Is y'all need to realize that you're racist. And this is the thing, like, oh my gosh, Doylin, you shouldn't be saying that. Listen here, y'all. White supremacy is in you. As white people, it is running through your veins. You are breathing that air every single day. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you a bad person if you don't do anything about it. If you just sit there and like, oh, like everything that is in this world, from healthcare to the car you drive, everything that is around you, your kids' schools, is all centered with the white experience in mind. So unless you truly get that and you believe that and you want to do your part to fix it, that's the thing. You have to own your own racism. You have to own it and own it's like, hey, my life has been benefited due to the systems that are around me. I want to do my part to dismantle it, because I could shout from the rooftops of a black man and y'all be like, okay, here's another dude waving the race card around, doing all this stuff. Like, no, I'm keeping it real with you. So that's the one thing. The second thing is hire anti-racism facilitators who will smack you around a bit. And quite frankly, I'm one of those people, but I think it's important that you have people who truly get it and will explain to you what systemic racism looks like, what other types of racism looks like, so you can truly open your eyes and then get into the fight and make this world a better place.
So I think going off of a similar idea, but like not quite, just make sure that there are people that can represent as many people as possible. Like, this includes ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion. Like, and how many cases do you see like natives' mental health being represented? None. And natives in general, like you never see them represented at all. So having people to represent them and speak for them and what they want and what they feel, I think is really important, especially if the group is for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Absolutely. You know, I think these are all just really great points. You can't invoke change within a community until you have people who are from that community at the table. So I'm gonna go to some audience questions. And I'm gonna add a little spin of my own. So mental illnesses tend to show themselves around or late teenage years, early adult years. But when should mental health education start? And in what form should we be giving mental health education?
I think we should start as early as possible, and it's even as early as like talking about feelings and how to identify what it is I'm feeling in this moment. And that can start really early on and continuing that conversation. I think if we normalize this idea that it is okay to feel and that it is okay to ask for support, it then becomes part of our culture to say mental health is real, mental health has stigma, but we are going to fight against that stigma.
Completely 100% agree. And also, I really think that we have failed our boys, our young boys growing up right now, where so often it's, I mean, even now, it's the man up culture, man up, dog, man up. But why don't we model for our kids that it's okay to cry? It's okay to raise your hand and ask for help. It's okay to say, hey, I'm feeling sad, Dad. I'm feeling sad. I don't know what to do. Like, I don't have boys. I used to be one. So I know that I grew up in that man up place, and it's really affected me as a grown up. And I want to make sure that young boys don't have to do that. And it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be real with your emotions and feel the gamut, because right now, the three acceptable emotions for men to feel publicly are lust, anger, and happiness. Those are the three emotions that you can put out there publicly. And sadness, being overwhelmed, like that stuff is not what dudes feel, but we need to normalize that. So I think to Jose's point, we should start as early as possible to let our boys know that that's okay.
So I'm going to be speaking as somebody who is technically, I guess, still a child in the eyes of most people. I wish that somebody would have started talking to me about mental health and mental health awareness from a young age. Like, I truly didn't really start becoming aware of this until I went to a public high school. And it would have helped me so much. And so in high school, I worked with NAMI in the Ending the Silence program and trying to implement that into different schools and everything. And I think one problem or one roadblock that we came across was that administration didn't really want something like that in their schools. And why? Like, what are the adults and the parents so afraid of that they don't want their children to be exposed to mental health awareness? Like, it doesn't make any sense. I feel like that is something that they just need to get over.
Absolutely. Really great points all around. I think the earlier we can normalize feeling feelings, I personally am a big crier. I cry a lot, and I don't really care anymore how uncomfortable that might make other people feel, because if I feel like crying, I'm gonna cry. We have time for one last question, and I really kind of want to make this personal. Tell me what your ideal world in regards to the way we talk and think about equity, diversity, inclusion, mental health. Tell me what that looks like.
The reason I became a speaker kind of full time was because I was doing a talk, and afterwards I noticed somebody was crying in the front row. So I went over and said, "How are you doing?" And that person started crying even more. And I thought, oh shoot, I really stepped in it now. I don't know what I did, but I did something. And that person looked me straight in the face and said, "You're the first person to ask me how I'm doing in 10 years. And it was that moment where I was like, I am going to be a speaker and I am going to do this for the rest of my life. And so when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and when I think about mental health, in my perfect world, we have a space for everyone to share their mental health story, for everyone to share what they need and what they deserve, and for us to engage in collective healing in a way that goes beyond identity, but includes identity in that. And I really do think that that could be possible. And I mean, people like you all here today, I mean, is the reason why I think it could be possible. And so I hope my perfect world comes true someday.
Well, I'm not a speaker and I'm not a writer. I'm just a college student. But I mean, what you were saying, I just think the perfect world would be where somebody like me or like people like you guys can just freely talk about what they're feeling and not be worried that, oh, you know, like I'm going to be judged or I'm not going to receive the care that, I mean, that we deserve. Like we deserve it as much as anybody else does. And I think that we should just work towards getting that care because we all need it.
And both of that's very well said. And my story is I don't live in North Carolina. I'm actually in Los Angeles. However, when I was younger, I lived in Greensboro for 1 year. And that 1 year, when I was 9 years old, was the first time I was ever called the N-word by a white person. I was 9. And I did not know what that word meant. I knew based on the anger that it was said to me that it was not a nice thing. And on top of that, also when I was there, I had a situation where I was talking to one of my teachers, and growing up, I had a really, really bad stutter. Like I was a really, really bad speech impediment. And my teacher was like, I think you should probably learn to work with your hands because you're not going to be able to speak to people for a living, my teacher said. So here I am now. I'm a TED Talk speaker. I speak for a living. I'm on stages all over the world, virtually and otherwise, and that's great. And the reason why I bring this up is not to pat myself on the back. It's just to say, whatever it is that you want to do, you can do. But I think it's important that I don't want to have kids go through the same hurdles that I went through. I don't want that to happen. I want these kids in a perfect world. Goes back to what I said when I just started this whole thing off. Don't be a jerk. I would use a different word if I could, but don't be a jerk. And if we just had that world where we just had nice people who valued people and had that, it treated everyone with equity, compassion, and love, it'd be a much better place than we have right now.
Thank you all so, so much for sharing your stories and sharing your experiences with us. And thank you to everyone who joined this panel. I think this was a wonderful discussion, and I'm really, really glad that I was able to be a part of it and able to learn from the three of you. So with that, I am going to go ahead and wrap it up. And, audience, will you please join me in thanking our panelists?